In Paraguay, Anastasio Somoza, ousted president of Nicaragua, is assassinated. Having been exiled by the Marxist Sandinista government, he dies when 6 men using machine guns and a bazooka ambush his limousine. Argentinian terrorists sympathetic to the left-wing Sandinistas are blamed.
Reagan will also be remembered as a man who truly believed in the Nicaraguan.
Destination point for Soviet arms is in Central America, where battles for influence are raging on many fronts: military, political, and diplomatic. The Reagan administration fears that communism will spread from Nicaragua to neighboring El Salvador.
The emergence of another country added to Cuba, Grenada, Nicaragua, another country, and then perhaps others, to Soviet-Cuban influence is bad news for this country.
Reagan approaches Congress claiming that Nicaragua's Sandinista regime is exporting its Marxist revolution to rebels in El Salvador, and he asks for a large budget increase in aid.
Nicaragua's new army numbers 25,000 men, supported by a militia of 50,000. It is the largest army in Central America. There are additional thousands of civilian advisors from Cuba, the Soviet Union, East Germany, Libya, and the PLO. And we're attacked because we have 55 military trainers in El Salvador.
3 years after the assassination of Salvadoran Archbishop Oscar Romero, the young democracy in El Salvador has not yet implemented humanitarian reforms. Through small death squads, the army continues to murder private citizens and opponents. While Congress shares Reagan's wish for democracy in El Salvador, the budget increase is made conditional to demonstrated reforms.
We believe the administration fundamentally misunderstands the causes of conflict in Central America. We cannot afford to found so important a policy on ignorance. And the painful truth is that many of our highest officials seem to know as little about Central America in 1983 as we knew about Indochina in 1963.
Then, Albert Schaufelberger, a U.S. advisor, is the first to be killed in El Salvador, and the cost of U.S. involvement can no longer be measured in dollars alone. On Nicaragua's northern border is Honduras, where the U.S. is also flexing its muscles, staging war games and training anti-Sandinista rebels, now called Contras. Reagan is watched carefully as he walks a fine legal line, since a year earlier, Congress had passed the Boland Amendment, outlawing covert aid to the counter-revolutionary forces.
Covert action ought to be cut off. We ought to turn that action into an overt action. That's exactly what we did.
Throughout the year, Nicaragua plays the bullied underdog, fighting for its right to political sovereignty. Foreign Minister Miguel Descoto accuses the U.S. of planning an all-out invasion of his country from Honduras.
They conceived it, they are directing it, they are financing it, and the United States is also arming it.
In March, 1,400 U.S.-backed Contras do invade Nicaragua, but they fail to hold any vital ground. The Contras' future activity is deadly, but limited to isolated guerrilla attacks. The Nicaraguan government is more angered than weakened by the Contras. As Nicaraguans die at the hands of the Contras, the people rally around leader Daniel Ortega and his Sandinista regime. In Nicaragua, the war between the Contras and the ruling Sandinistas continues. This band of guerrilla soldiers is trying to overthrow the government of Daniel Ortega. The Contras cause is an emotional one for President Reagan, who takes a stand against the presence of communism in the Western Hemisphere. He finds himself in a bitter battle over funding for the Nicaraguan Contras, and the intensity of his appeals to Congress and to the American people on the rebels' behalf is unprecedented.
They are the moral equal of our founding fathers and the brave men and women of the French resistance.
The president asks for $100 million for the Contras, most of it in military aid. Congress is wary. With the administration refusing to talk to Ortega and already unable to account for $15 million in past aid, Congress demands a more coherent U.S. policy, which stresses negotiations, not military aid.
I would hope and pray that the policy of this government would be the policy of diplomacy and not gunboat diplomacy.
In March, Congress denies the aid request for fiscal 1986, and the president's hands appear to be tied. Washington can give no money this year because the 3-year-old Boland Amendment outlaws any covert aid to the Contras. A network of private citizens is undertaking its own fundraising efforts. Encouraged by the president, they raise money to supply the Contras.
We have received some funds from private sources. Now we are improving our supply situation.
But questions arise quickly about the integrity and safety of some of these private networks. In October, an American C-123 cargo plane is shot down over Nicaragua. 2 crew members are killed, but 1 American, Eugene Hasenfuss, is captured by the Sandinistas. Hasenfuss admits to transporting automatic weapons, ammunition, and boots to the Contras.
Is sentenced to the maximum term of 30 years imprisonment for violation of Article 1
and goes to a Nicaraguan jail. He is soon pardoned by Daniel Ortega and returns to the United States.
The whole delaying operation, this on-again, off-again battle between the executive branch and the Congress, basically the House of Representatives, has caused a combat situation right here on North American soil to involve all sorts of private Rambo-esque groups. And it was inevitable that Americans would be killed and 1 captured.
Humanitarian aid office.
Partly because of the Hasenfuss incident, people begin to look deeper into the backdoor channels of Contra aid, and a Pandora's box of activity is opened. Many former drug runners, familiar with the air routes in Central America, have been recruited to deliver arms to the rebels, and some admit to transporting drugs on their way back to the United States.
You'd bring the ship into Colombia, you would load drugs aboard it, and you would bring those drugs back to Panama with you.
Logbooks and testimony cite many such missions in 1986. According to some crew members, the Reagan administration chose to look the other way when it could have just said no. Then, on November 3rd, a Beirut magazine breaks the story that soon becomes the biggest scandal in the U.S. since Watergate. Iran, the country that held Americans hostage in 1980, the country that was behind the bombings of the American embassy and the Marine barracks in Beirut in 1983, is now allowed to purchase embargoed U.S. arms through a middleman, Israel. Profits from these sales are used to fund the Contra War, which many claim is illegal and in violation of the Boland Amendment. As details are uncovered, the scandal soon becomes known as Iran-Contra.
This city is awash with rumor, intrigue, treachery. Laws have been broken. At the very center of the White House, there has been the most unbelievable revelations.
Gradually, it became increasingly clear that what we were talking about was a swamp of weapons for hostages, and then we got into the whole area of funding being provided for the Contras through a backdoor kind of an arrangement.
As I've stated previously, I believe our policy goals toward Iran were well-founded.
However, the information brought to my attention yesterday convinced me that in one aspect, implementation of that policy was seriously flawed.
Reagan's policy goals were threefold. The president's credibility is severely shaken. Either he's in control of a disastrous policy, or he has lost control of his own administration.
To brief you,
he's caught between that dilemma of either being accused of having known or being accused of having not known. Whichever it was is bound to lead to some criticism.
The president's stature is diminished. Trying to put the incident behind him, he appoints a commission to investigate, headed by John Tower. But it's the Iran-Contra congressional hearings, televised now.
And outgoing President Daniel Ortega. Ortega said an immediate disbanding was key to a peaceful transition of power. But so far, the Contra leaders say no. They say they'll remain armed until Chamorro takes office in April and until the Sandinista army is dissolved.